The year was 1542, and a silence, thick and suffocating, had fallen over the Tower of London, a quiet so profound it seemed to swallow the very sound of the river's flow. Within those cold, damp stone walls, a queen, or rather a girl who had been queen, spent her final night practicing her death. She was barely a woman, a teenager swept up in the brutal pageant of power, only to be dashed upon its rocks. They said she had asked for the executioner's block to be brought to her chambers, a strange and macabre request, so she might know how to place her head. Imagine the scene, a slender neck rehearsing its final violent meeting with sharpened steel. What brought this child, Henry VIII's Rose Without a Thorn, to this grim rehearsal? It is a story not just of personal failing, but of a court so steeped in ambition and paranoia that it devoured its own. And now, please stop the video and subscribe to our channel. To be able to keep making videos like this, we need to reach 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Thank you. As we delve into this tale of ruin, prepare yourself, for it is a journey into the heart of a kingdom ruled by a man who was more a force of nature than a mere monarch. By 1540, King Henry VIII was no longer the handsome, athletic prince of his youth. He was a bloated, suppurating creature of immense pain and terrifying volatility. An old jousting wound on his leg had ulcerated, a foul-smelling, constantly weeping sore that tormented him daily, poisoning his body and his temper in equal measure. His vast ego, already legendary, was now curdled by suspicion and a deep, gnawing insecurity about his own mortality and his kingdom's future. He had broken with Rome, beheaded one queen, divorced another, and lost a third to childbirth, all in a desperate quest for a legitimate male heir and a stable succession. His fourth marriage, a political alliance to the German Princess Anne of Cleves, had ended in a swift and humiliating annulment, with the king famously declaring his inability to consummate the union, a public admission of impotence that only stoked the fires of his private rage. Into this cauldron of royal despair and political maneuvering stepped Catherine Howard, a jewel presented at the perfect perilous moment. She was the niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, the leader of the conservative Catholic faction at court, who saw in his vivacious, pretty niece a key to unlock the ultimate power. The Howards were ascendant, a family whose ambition was matched only by their ruthlessness, and they placed Catherine at court like a carefully positioned chess piece, a pawn designed to become a queen and secure their dominance over their rivals, most notably the reformist faction led by the Seymour family. She was to be the antidote to the German mare, the Flanders mare, a youthful, vibrant English rose who would captivate the ailing king, soothe his wounded pride, and most importantly, bind him inextricably to the Howard cause. It was a brilliant political gambit, a play for the very soul of England, but it was one that placed an unconscionable weight upon the slender shoulders of a girl who was woefully, tragically unprepared for the role she was being forced to play. Her own history, a past filled with secrets and youthful indiscretions, was a poison seed that, once planted in the fertile ground of the Tudor court, could only grow into a tree of destruction, its branches reaching for everyone who had ever touched her. The stage was set for a tragedy of truly epic proportions, a story of how a teenage girl's quest for affection collided with the brutal realities of dynastic politics, leading to one of the most infamous and horrific downfalls in English history. To understand the tragedy of the Queen, one must first journey back to the chaotic, morally ambiguous world that forged the girl. Catherine Howard was not raised in the structured, rigorous environment typical for a high-born lady of her era. Instead, her formative years were spent in the sprawling, under-supervised household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Lambeth Palace. This was not a palace of decorum and scholarly pursuit, but a bustling, almost bohemian establishment, a place where dozens of young, well-born but impoverished wards were housed together with little oversight. The aging duchess was often absent at court, leaving her young charges to their own devices in what was known as the maiden's chamber. Here, secrets were currency and flirtation was a pastime. It was a hothouse environment where youthful desires bloomed in the shadows, far from the prying eyes of their guardians. It was in this setting that the first threads of Catherine's undoing were spun. She caught the attention of her music tutor, a man named Henry Manox, who, emboldened by the lax atmosphere, groomed the young girl, engaging in intimacies that, while perhaps stopping short of the final act, represented a profound and dangerous breach of trust and social mores. He was infatuated, and she, a young girl likely starved for affection and attention, was drawn into a clandestine relationship that planted the first seeds of her later reputation. But this was merely a prelude, a whisper of the storm to come. A far more serious entanglement followed with a gentleman named Francis Derham, a secretary in the Duchess's household. Theirs was not a mere flirtation. Witnesses would later describe a passionate, fully consummated affair. Derham and Catherine reportedly called each other husband and wife, a verbal contract that, in the eyes of the church at that time, held a dangerous weight, constituting a potential pre-contract of marriage. They shared a bed, exchanged gifts, and spoke of a future together, all under the noses of the other girls in the chamber. It was reckless, passionate, and utterly catastrophic. The affair was eventually discovered, leading to a furious confrontation and Derham's banishment from the household, but the damage was done. The secret of this relationship was now shared knowledge among a small circle of people, a network of former chambermaids and servants who carried the knowledge of Catherine's past with them. When her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, plucked her from this obscurity and placed her into the dazzling, lethal spotlight of the royal court, he was either ignorant of this history or, more likely, chose to willfully ignore it, a fatal miscalculation. He saw only her youth and her beauty as assets, failing to recognize that her past was a liability of monumental proportions, a ghost that would inevitably follow her through the grand corridors of power. Her arrival at court was nothing short of a political masterstroke, a perfectly timed move in the high-stakes game of Tudor succession and influence. Placed as a lady-in-waiting to the new queen, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard was a vibrant splash of color against a drab canvas. Where Anne was plain, reserved, and foreign, Catherine was petite, vivacious, and quintessentially English. She was charming, she could sing and dance, and she possessed a youthful energy that was intoxicating to the aging, ailing king. Henry VIII, trapped in a marriage he found repulsive and smarting from the public humiliation of his own proclaimed impotence, was instantly besotted. He saw in Catherine not just a pretty face, but a chance at rejuvenation, a fountain of youth that could wash away his sickness, his anxieties, and his political frustrations. The courtship was a whirlwind, a public spectacle of royal infatuation. The king, a man in his late 40s, acted like a lovesick boy, showering the teenager with gifts of land, jewels, and fine clothes. He called her his rose without a thorn, his very jewel of womanhood, a public declaration that was as much about convincing himself as it was about praising her. For Henry, Catherine was a symbol of his own virility and power, a beautiful young prize that proved to the world, and to himself, that he was still the magnificent monarch of his youth. The annulment from Anne of Cleves was pursued with ruthless speed, and just 16 days after it was finalized, in the summer of 1540, Henry married Catherine in a private ceremony. At not yet 20 years old, Catherine Howard, the girl from the unsupervised Lambeth household, was Queen of England. For her family, the Howards, it was the ultimate triumph. Their blood now sat on the throne, their influence was supreme, and their conservative religious agenda seemed secure. They had outmaneuvered their rivals, the Seymours, and had placed their niece at the very center of power. But the gilded cage of royalty was a dangerous place for a girl with so many secrets. The very people who knew of her past, the witnesses to her affair with Francis Derham, saw her elevation not as a distant triumph, but as a golden opportunity. Believing their silence could be bought or that their connection to the new queen entitled them to favor, they began to emerge from the shadows, seeking positions at court, inadvertently bringing the ticking bomb of Catherine's history right into the heart of the palace. The rose may have looked perfect on the outside, but its roots were entangled in a past that could not be pruned away so easily. The court celebrated the new queen, a symbol of hope and royal happiness, entirely unaware that her reign was built upon a foundation of terrifying fragility. Life as queen was a dizzying ascent into a world of unimaginable luxury and suffocating protocol. For a time, Catherine seemed to revel in it, embracing the lavish lifestyle that came with being the consort of the King of England. Henry, utterly enthralled with his young bride, was more indulgent than ever. He granted her vast estates, a household teeming with servants, and a wardrobe of breathtaking expense, filled with French gowns, jewels, and furs. The royal couple embarked on a grand progress through the north of England in 1541, a spectacular display of power and pageantry designed to awe the region that had once risen in rebellion against the king's religious reforms. Catherine was at the center of this spectacle, the beautiful young queen at the side of the magnificent king. Yet, beneath the veneer of royal bliss, the pressures of her position began to mount. She was a teenager, uneducated in the complex arts of politics and diplomacy, surrounded by seasoned schemers and whispers of intrigue. Her primary duty, as with all of Henry's queens, was to produce a male heir, a constant, unspoken pressure that hung over her every day. Furthermore, the vibrant, flirty girl found the formal, restrictive life of a queen to be a gilded cage. She was constantly watched, her every move scrutinized. The freedom she had known at Lambeth was gone, replaced by a rigid etiquette that governed every waking moment. It was in this environment of boredom and isolation that she made her most fatal error. Instead of distancing herself from her past, she brought it closer. Perhaps out of a sense of obligation, or a naive belief that she could control the narrative of her own life, she appointed several individuals from the Dowager Duchess's household to her own royal retinue. Most catastrophically, she gave a position as a gentleman usher to none other than Francis Derham, the man with whom she had shared a bed and a promise of marriage. It was an act of breathtaking recklessness. By bringing him into the royal household, she not only kept her greatest secret dangerously close, but also signaled to others from her past that the new queen was accessible. Another figure from her Lambeth days, a woman named Joan Bulmer, wrote to her, half jokingly, half threateningly, "When I last saw you, you were a maiden. And you are a maiden still." The implication was clear. We know who you were. The cage was becoming smaller, the air thinner, and Catherine, restless and perhaps lonely, began to seek a different kind of affection, one that reminded her of the freedom she had lost. Her gaze fell upon one of the king's own favorites, a man whose proximity to the throne made him the most dangerous choice of all. The object of the queen's dangerous affections was Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Culpeper was everything the aging Henry was not. He was young, handsome, and charismatic, known at court for his fashionable attire and his swagger. He was also a trusted and favored courtier of the king, often sleeping in the royal bedchamber, a position of intimate access and immense privilege. He had a reputation as a womanizer and a man of volatile temper, but to the young, isolated queen, he must have seemed like a dashing figure from a romance. The connection between them was facilitated by one of the queen's most trusted ladies-in-waiting, a woman who should have known better, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford was herself a figure of tragedy and scandal. She was the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, who had been executed alongside his sister, partly on the basis of his own wife's testimony. Now, she became the go-between for another queen and a courtier, arranging secret meetings and carrying messages. What followed was a series of clandestine encounters, breathtaking in their audacity. Using her position, Lady Rochford would arrange for Culpeper to be brought up the back stairs to the queen's chambers late at night, often while the court was on its royal progress. While the ailing king slept, his young wife was entertaining a lover just rooms away. They were not merely innocent meetings. Catherine reportedly gave Culpeper gifts, and a letter, believed to be in her own hand, was later discovered. In it, she expressed her longing for him, writing, "My heart is very sore," and ending with the devastatingly incriminating line, "Yours as long as life endures." It was a declaration of love, a piece of tangible evidence that sealed her fate. This was not a pre-royal indiscretion like the Derham affair. This was adultery committed by the Queen of England against the king himself. It was high treason. The sheer recklessness of it is difficult to comprehend. Perhaps Catherine believed herself untouchable, protected by the king's obsessive love. Perhaps she was simply a naive teenager, driven by loneliness and a desire for genuine affection, unable to grasp the mortal danger of her actions. Whatever the reason, she was playing with fire in a palace made of gunpowder, surrounded by enemies who were simply waiting for a spark. The affair did not remain secret for long. In a court built on gossip and surveillance, Such a high-stakes liaison was a secret impossible to keep. The whispers had already begun. The unraveling of Queen Catherine's world began not with a thunderclap but with a whisper, a single voice speaking a dangerous truth into the right ear. The catalyst was a man named John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer whose sister, Mary Hall, had been a servant in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household at Lambeth. She had been a witness to Catherine's youthful affair with Francis Derham. Lascelles, who held no love for the conservative Howard family, saw an opportunity to bring down his political and religious enemies. He approached the one man he knew would understand the gravity of the information and have the courage to act upon it, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was a leading figure of the English Reformation and a shrewd political survivor who had navigated the treacherous currents of Henry's court for years. He listened intently as Lascelles relayed his sister's story of the Queen's unchaste past, of the nights spent with Derham and their premarital promises. Cranmer understood immediately the calamitous implications. This was not mere gossip. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Howard faction and a direct threat to the stability of the crown. He knew that presenting such explosive information to the volatile king was a task fraught with peril. Accusing the king's beloved rose without a thorn could easily be seen as treason itself if the charges could not be proven. Henry was, at this moment, at the zenith of his happiness with Catherine, publicly declaring that he had never known such marital bliss. To shatter this illusion would be to invite the full, terrifying force of the king's wrath. Cranmer proceeded with extreme caution, first launching a discreet investigation. He sought out Mary Hall herself, who confirmed every detail her brother had relayed. The more he dug, the worse it became. The investigation soon uncovered not only the old affair with Derham but also the far more treasonous secret of the Queen's current relationship with Thomas Culpeper. The web of deceit was far larger and more dangerous than he had initially imagined, implicating not just the Queen, but a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and the Queen's own lady-in-waiting, Lady Rochford. Armed with irrefutable evidence and sworn testimonies, Cranmer knew he could no longer keep the secret. During Mass on All Saints' Day in 1541, as the king gave public thanks to God for the good life he lived with his perfect queen, Archbishop Cranmer quietly slipped a letter into Henry's hand, detailing the devastating accusations. The king's reaction was not immediate, explosive rage, but something far more chilling, utter disbelief. He dismissed the letter as a malicious fabrication, a vile conspiracy concocted by his enemies to rob him of his happiness. He could not, or would not, believe that his jewel, his perfect rose, could be so tarnished. He ordered Cranmer to investigate further, convinced that the archbishop would uncover the plot and expose the liars. This royal command, however, gave Cranmer the authority he needed to act decisively. He moved swiftly, arresting Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper, as well as key witnesses from the Lambeth household. Under intense interrogation in the Tower of London, likely accompanied by the threat, if not the application of torture, the story came tumbling out. Derham, perhaps hoping for mercy, confessed to his carnal relationship with Catherine before her marriage to the king, but vehemently denied any wrongdoing since she had become queen. Crucially, in an attempt to deflect blame, he implicated Thomas Culpeper, claiming that the queen favored him now. This was the final nail in the coffin. When the interrogators turned their attention to Culpeper, they found the incriminating love letter from Catherine, the tangible proof of their treasonous affair. Faced with the evidence, both Culpeper and the Queen's go-between, Lady Rochford, confessed to their roles in the secret meetings. Cranmer now possessed a complete and damning account of the Queen's entire romantic history, both before and during her marriage. He presented this overwhelming evidence to the king. The impact was cataclysmic. Henry's disbelief shattered, replaced by a storm of fury, grief, and profound self-pity. Chroniclers reported that the great king, the fearsome ruler of England, broke down completely, weeping and lamenting his terrible fortune in being yoked to such ill-conditioned wives. He raged against his council for having brought her to him and then turned his fury upon Catherine herself, ordering her immediate confinement. The illusion of his happy marriage was not just broken, it was ground into dust, revealing the bitter reality beneath. For Henry, this was the ultimate betrayal, a personal wound far deeper than any political failure, an attack on his honor, his manhood, and his judgment. There would be no mercy. The legal and political machinery of the Tudor state, an instrument honed by Henry for just such purposes, now turned its full, terrifying force upon the young queen and all who were connected to her. The fall was as swift as the ascent had been dazzling. One moment Catherine was the Queen of England, the center of the court's universe. The next, she was a prisoner, her world shrinking to the confines of her chambers at Hampton Court Palace. When the council, led by a grim-faced Archbishop Cranmer, confronted her with the charges, she initially reacted with panic denial. But as the weight of the evidence, the confessions of Derham and Culpeper, was laid before her, she collapsed into a state of what was described as frenzy. She was seized by fits of terror and hysteria, her composure utterly deserting her. It was the terrified reaction not of a calculating adulteress, but of a frightened girl who had just realized the mortal consequence of her actions. She was stripped of her title as queen, her royal household was disbanded, and she was sent into a form of house arrest at the former Sion Abbey. Meanwhile, the vengeance of the state proceeded with brutal efficiency. In December of 1541, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were tried and found guilty of high treason. Their sentences were horrific, even for the standards of the time. Culpeper, due to his noble birth and former favor with the king, was granted the slight mercy of a simple beheading. His head was placed on a pike atop London Bridge. Francis Derham, however, as a commoner who had dared to touch a future queen, was afforded no such leniency. He was subjected to the full, barbaric ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. He was partially strangled, disemboweled while still alive, and then his body was hacked into 4 pieces. A gruesome public spectacle designed as a terrifying warning to any who would dare to transgress against the king's honor. The Howards, Catherine's powerful family, were disgraced. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, scrambled to save his own skin, writing a groveling letter to the king in which he condemned his ungracious niece and niece-in-law, Lady Rochford, and thanked the king for not condemning him along with them. The family's ambition had led them to the pinnacle of power, and now it had brought them to the brink of ruin. While imprisoned at Sion, Catherine herself finally broke down and produced a full, desperate confession, detailing her history with Derham and admitting her indiscretions with Culpeper. Though she maintained that their relationship had not been fully consummated, it mattered little. In January of 1542, Parliament passed a Bill of Attainder, a legislative act that declared a person guilty of a crime without the formality of a trial. It condemned Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, to death for high treason. The bill received royal assent, and the final act of the tragedy was set. Catherine was moved from Sion to her final destination, the grim, foreboding fortress of the Tower of London. The final 24 hours of Catherine Howard's life were a meticulously staged piece of political theater, designed to project the absolute and terrible power of the Tudor state. On the evening of February 12, 1542, within the cold stone confines of her quarters in the Tower, the condemned girl reportedly made her strange request. She asked that the executioner's block be brought to her, a morbid prop for a final rehearsal. Imagine the scene: the rough, solid wood, stained with the memory of past executions, carried into her room. She spent hours with it, this ghost of her own demise, practicing how to kneel, how to place her neck, ensuring that in her final public moment she would not falter. It was perhaps a last, desperate attempt to reclaim a shred of agency, to control the final performance of a life that had spiraled so catastrophically out of her control. On the morning of February 13th, a cold and gray winter day, the stage was set. Within the tower's walls, on a scaffold erected on Tower Green, a space reserved for executions of high-ranking prisoners, a small crowd of dignitaries and officials gathered. This was not to be a public spectacle for the common folk of London, but a private, solemn warning to the ruling class. Catherine was led from her rooms, accompanied by the constable of the Tower. She was said to have appeared pale and frail, yet composed. Lady Rochford, her co-conspirator and companion in death, was also brought forth. Catherine mounted the scaffold, looked out upon the small, grim assembly, and delivered her final speech. The words that have come down through history, though likely polished by chroniclers, paint a picture of piety and repentance. She was reported to have confessed her sins admitting that she deserved to die for her betrayal of a merciful and generous prince. She acknowledged the justice of her sentence, but maintained that her ultimate punishment was deserved not for the crimes committed as queen, but for the immoral life she had led before ever meeting the king. In her final moments, she reportedly spoke the name of Thomas Culpeper, declaring that she died a queen, but would have rather died the wife of Culpeper. It was a final, haunting admission of love, a last flicker of the reckless passion that had brought her to this place. Then she knelt, laid her head upon the cold, practiced wood of the block, and with a single, swift strike of the executioner's axe, it was over. The life of Catherine Howard, the teenage queen, was extinguished. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, followed her moments later. Two more heads, symbols of female frailty and treason, would soon join the grim display on London Bridge. The death of Catherine Howard sent a shockwave through the Tudor court, but it was a wave of fear and consolidation, not of rebellion. Her execution served its intended purpose as a terrifying demonstration of the king's absolute power and the fatal consequences of betrayal, both personal and political. In the immediate aftermath, the king and parliament moved to codify this terror into law. An act was passed making it high treason for any woman with an unchaste past to agree to marry the king without first disclosing her history to him. It became known colloquially as the Act for the Chastity of Queens, a piece of legislation born directly from Henry's personal humiliation, forever linking the female body to the security of the state. The once mighty Howard family was thoroughly humbled. Though the Duke of Norfolk had successfully distanced himself from his niece's fall, his family's prestige was deeply wounded, and their influence at court was eclipsed by their rivals. They had flown too close to the sun on the waxen wings of their niece's youth, and the fall was severe. Henry VIII himself was forever changed. The betrayal of his rose without a thorn seemed to extinguish the last embers of romanticism within him. He sank deeper into paranoia and ill health, becoming the tyrannical, isolated figure of his final years. He would marry one more time to the pious and steady Catherine Parr, who would serve more as a nursemaid and companion than a romantic partner. The ghost of Catherine Howard, the vivacious girl who had briefly made him feel young again, would haunt the remainder of his reign. Her legacy is a complex and somber one. For centuries, she was dismissed as a wanton, a foolish and immoral girl who brought about her own deserved destruction. But a more modern, nuanced view sees her as a tragic figure, a victim as much as a villain. She was a teenager, thrust into a world of immense power and lethal intrigue for which she was utterly unprepared. Her downfall was orchestrated by her own youthful recklessness, yes, but it was also a direct consequence of the ambitions of her family, the predatory nature of the Tudor court, and the wounded pride of a terrifying king. Her story serves as a timeless and chilling reminder of the vulnerability of individuals when caught in the grinding gears of power, a morbid historical lesson on how personal desires can become political treason and how a girl once called a jewel could be so quickly and brutally discarded and destroyed.